The Great Train Robbery of 1963 involved a group of men who planned to rob an overnight mail train coming from Glasgow into London. They had been used to small jobs, maybe only a few £1,000s, but this one offered something very different. Typically, this train carried around £300,000 on board, but given the previous weekend was a bank holiday, they expected the total to be slightly higher. It was only when they counted the money for themselves that they realised they had stolen £2.6 million, which has an approximate value of £70 million today. How did a group of untrained thieves pull off a robbery of this magnitude? Well, today I'm here to answer that question and talk about the Great Train Robbery of 1963. The group of thieves behind the operation was quite extensive. It consisted of 17 people, of which Bruce Reynolds was the leader. He was also the leader of the Southwest Gang and so worked closely with a number of other members who he knew prior to the robbery. Other notable accomplices include Douglas Goody, who was one of 3 main organisers, along with Charles Wilson and Ronald Edwards. Despite Bruce's initial efforts to keep the idea limited to a few people, he soon realised he'd need a number of external members to help him pull it off. He had connections with a retired train driver who he'd later rely on to change the signals which forced the train to stop. This person was also going to be responsible for driving the train from where it stopped to Bridego Bridge, which is where they offloaded the cash into a number of vehicles. Even though some roles were much more significant than others, the total amount of money they stole was split equally among the robbers. So despite, for example, Danny Pembroke essentially being an extra muscle man, he was paid the same as Reynolds, who led the entire operation. Later on, it would become apparent that Reynolds was not cut out for a job like this because of his quite underwhelming criminal past. Reynolds wasn't experienced in anything major when it came to crime. In 1957, he was arrested for robbing £500 from a bookmaker, followed by a train robbery a couple of years later where he only managed to get £700. In 1962, him and his gang robbed an impressive £62,000 from a security van in London, which was by far the highest amount he'd ever managed to get. It was only a few months later that he was introduced to the overnight mail train at Euston Station. At first he was doubtful. How was he going to pull off a robbery of that scale? It was only after he went to see for himself that he realised how doable it might actually be. He noticed a lack of security on board and decided that this would be his big break as a criminal. It was perfect for him. He got to make a lot of money while also fulfilling his dream of pulling off a heist that would make him someone to remember, only if he managed to pull it off. The plan to pull off this robbery was based almost entirely on claims made by an unknown Royal Mail security officer, who was the person that introduced Reynolds to the job in the first place. He was sceptical at first, but after hearing that he could get upwards of £300,000, it would have taken a lot to convince him not to do it. It was actually quite simple. A Royal Mail overnight train would leave Glasgow Central Station at around 7 PM and arrive at London Euston Station at around 5 AM the next morning. All they'd have to do is intercept it at a quiet spot somewhere along the line. The first main question was where they'd actually commit the crime. To get the most cash, it would have to be somewhere between Euston and the previous stop. As well as this, it would have to be somewhere quiet, close to a road, and not too far from somewhere that they could use as a hideout for potentially weeks afterwards. The main factor though was having a signal close by so that they could actually stop the train. The way they do this is by taking off the back of the signal box, turning on the red bulb, and sliding a glove over the green one, which gave the illusion of a red signal. Taking all of this into consideration, the perfect spot would be right here, just outside Leighton Buzzard at Bridego Bridge. What made it even more perfect was that it was only 27 miles away from Leatherstade Farm, which they thought was a good place to use as a hideout. Sounds simple enough, but not everything went entirely to plan. The night began with a lot of optimism. The train left Glasgow at exactly 6:50 PM. At the same time the Royal Mail workers were sorting letters and packages, the gang was driving down to Bridego Bridge. The train pulled into Crewe Station at approximately 1:40, giving the robbers plenty of time to walk to the signal where the leader of the South Coast Raiders, Roger Caudry, would explain how to change the lights using the glove method. By the time everything had been sorted and everyone was in position, it was 2:50 AM. The train came round a bend where the driver inevitably noticed the yellow signal and began to slow the train down, where it stopped perfectly in position just in front of where everyone was hiding. The train stopped a couple of minutes past 3 AM, and the driver, Jack, was immediately sceptical, as despite the overhead signal being red, he could clearly see the next signal along was still green. Because of this, he told the second crew member, David, to leave the train and phone a signalman from the line-side telephone. As this was happening, 2 of the gang ran underneath the train to uncouple the carriages. Since the crew didn't anticipate him phoning the signalman, they had to improvise, and they did so so by having one person run onto the track, distracting David, who decided to go and investigate what was happening. Of course, this was a setup, and David was ambushed by other members of the gang. After they jumped him, the next step was to gain access to the driver's carriage, which they managed to do fairly easily. Everything was going perfectly, and the rest of the train had been uncoupled, allowing them to drive off freely. Except, it wasn't quite as simple as that. The retired train driver they had recruited wasn't quite as able as they thought he was, since he hadn't driven a proper train in decades. They ended up pushing him aside and roping in the original train driver to move it along to the bridge. After what was probably the longest 10 minutes of their lives, they finally got to Bridego Bridge at 3:13 AM, which is where the crew broke into the second carriage through the windows, took control of the workers on board, and began to offload the money into the vehicles. After they had all the money off the train and into the vans, they hurried back to the farmhouse. As far as anyone outside the train was concerned, absolutely nothing had happened. After the 45-minute journey back to the farm, consisting of silence from the crew as they listened to police broadcast on a radio, they made it back to the farmhouse at around 4:30 AM. There was no hesitation in what they did next, and that of course was count the money that they just stole. This is when they found out the scale of their crime. They were sure it would only be a few $100,000, $1 million at a push, but it turned out they had stolen over £2.5 million. After splitting the money between the members, they proceeded to hide out at the farmhouse for a number of days before the police revealed some critical information. The police said on the radio that the hideout of the gang was within a 30-mile radius of the crime scene, but how did they know? Well, this is where one or two extremely important mistakes are made. During the robbery itself, after they stole all of the cash, one of the robbers told the workers in the carriage to stay on the ground for 30 minutes or they'd be killed. One of them then relayed this information to the police, who assumed that they wanted that 30 minutes to get to their hideout location, so the police started searching various abandoned farmhouses in the radius. Such a quick investigation didn't leave the team much time, so they frantically began cleaning the farmhouse, burning any clothing and making it look abandoned. The plan was to send someone otherwise uninvolved with the crime to burn down the farmhouse before the police got to it. Unfortunately, this didn't work out because shortly after the gang left, the police managed to not only find it, but they also found incriminating evidence that would later be used against them. You may be wondering what their second critical mistake was, and that was them not cleaning everything fully. The incriminating evidence which led to the arrest of the majority of the gang had been found. The evidence? A Monopoly board, which was covered in fingerprints from when they were playing the night prior, so it wasn't long before the police had all the names and faces they needed. A number of arrests took place over the following years, but they didn't manage to catch Reynolds until November 1968, well over 5 years after the crime was committed. Most of the crew got sentenced to between 20 and 30 years in prison, but none of them actually served for that long. Reynolds was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but was released after only 10. Thank you so much for watching, ladies and gentlemen. If you haven't already, please remember to like and subscribe. Bye bye my friends, I'll see you in the next one.